Awesome, welcome back. In this one we're going to start going over skeletons and binding skin to the skeletons so that you can make characters and whatever else you can come up with. You can see in this scene already I've just set up 4 cylinders. These two are identical and these two are identical. Notice that the only difference is the amount of subdivisions along the height, and that will be important later. Another thing I want to point out right up front, a couple of things actually. When you're working with skeletons do have to be drawn in the side view, or not necessarily the side, but in one of the orthographic views, just because it makes things a lot easier, and it may be helpful when you're working with a skeleton inside of a character to go to shading and down to X-ray so that you can still see the shapes, but you can see through them so you can tell exactly where your skeleton is. So if you're looking at this and you say, what the hell, why is cylinder see-through? That's because I went to shading and I turned on X-ray. It's something I recommend for working with skeletons. Now, when you're working with skeletons, the reason I say they should be made in one of the orthographic views, top, front, or side, is as such. If you go to the animation shelf, there's this blue button here that is called the joint tool. That's for putting in skeletons. So that's the one we're working with in this video. Or you can go up to skeleton and down to joint tool on your animation menu subset, which the keyboard shortcut for is F2. Okay. Well, I'm just going to grab it off my shelf, click the joint tool. Now, let's just pretend that these cylinders represent a leg. Okay. So we'd have the hip up here, we'd have a knee in the middle, we have an ankle at the bottom. So if I click once, I can put in a hip joint. If I click again, we'll put in a knee joint. And if I click again, I put in an ankle joint. So from here, that looks alright. I'll hit enter to finalize the joint chain. Now, it looks like it's straight up and down, but like I said way back in the beginning, some things you just want to do in all 4 views, because now you can see I've got this huge leg that's definitely laying flat. So, difference being, if I were to do it in the side view, I can just grab my joint tool, click one up where the hip is, one down where the knee should be, one where the ankle should be, and I put a little bend in there out of habit. You'll get kind of in the habit of doing that when you start using IK chains, which we'll explain later. Now all I have to do, grab my selection tool, hit enter to confirm the joint chain. Now, joints are set up in a hierarchy already by default. The first joint, if you select the first joint, it will select the whole chain. If you select the second joint, it will select the rest of the chain. If you select the very last joint, it only selects the last joint. So, I'm going to go ahead and select the first joint of that chain and move it into place about in the leg here. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and just select this one and get rid of it because I don't need it. So now you see, you can kind of see in the top view it's pretty well centered. So now let's have a look and see what exactly it is this joint is doing here. It's exactly what it looks like. The circles are joints, and basically these triangle tetrahedron things that go between them, the fancy word for pyramid things, are the bones. So I put on my rotate tool and I have this one selected. You see I can sort of bend the joint here. So I could bend this, and then I could select this one, and I could rotate it up if I wanted to move legs and such, or what have you. But for now, we're just going to put that in the center of the cylinder. I'm going to select my joint chain, Control or Command D to duplicate it, put on my move tool. Basically, I just want each one of these cylinders to have their own joint chain, so you can kind of see the difference. Okay, so now I've got joints inside of what should be legs or arms or cylinders with bones, because that's how I roll. On the animation palette or menu subset, there's an option for skin, and then you go down to bind skin. Oops, I didn't mean to click that, I meant to click this so that I can just tear that menu out. There's smooth bind and there's rigid bind. Rigid bind is what we're going to go over first, because that was actually the first kind of skinning that they had. Let's see, you can actually see that I already bound on accident. When I clicked, I actually bound the skin to the skeleton. You can tell by the fact that it's multicolored. So I'm just going to go ahead and undo that, because I don't want to do a smooth bind just yet. So I select my bones first, and then I select, the object that they're binding to, and I'm going to go to rigid bind. I'm going to click on the little square so you can see the options, which are not so amazing. Bind method, it binds the skeleton to the closest point, the whole skeleton, instead of just the selected joints. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit bind skin. So that was a rigid bind, and I'm going to do the same thing for this one. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click rigid bind. Now you'll kind of see the difference. On this cylinder, I've got a whole lot of geometry. I've got a lot of extra polygons because it's divided so much. This one, not so much. So if I were to take this joint, this center joint, and we're just going to rotate it. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'll rotate both of them. I'm going to select this joint, I'm going to select this joint, and I'm just going to rotate them, and you can start to see what the difference is. Okay, for this, I will turn off X-ray, and I'm going to let go. So, you can see on the shape with the most geometry, it deforms in the center here, but it's a little bit smoother. A little bit. On this one, with not very much geometry, you can very much tell there's corners there. Okay? So, I'm not really a big fan of rigid bind unless I'm working on something like a robot or something like that. But the more geometry it has to work with, the smoother it can make those curves look. Rigid bind really doesn't smooth a whole lot out anyway, that's why it's called rigid bind. But on these two, I'm going to select it, I'm going to click smooth bind. It's got similar stuff in the options, just what do you want to bind it to, how do you want to bind it, etc., etc. I'm just going to click bind skin. I'm going to do the same for this one, smooth bind. And now you can see in the one with the geometry and the one with not as much geometry, we'll hit X-ray again and select the joints and rotate. Now we'll turn off X-ray so you can kind of see this. This is where it makes a huge difference. Since I don't have much geometry in here, it can only deform around the edges here, or where the edge goes around the object. Since there's only two edge loops in the center of that object, it has to deform here, and it has to deform here. On this one, what smooth bind is nice for, since I have a lot of geometry, it will kind of spread that out. So instead of just binding around instead of just deforming around this edge loop, it sort of disperses it all the way around in a very much more organic way. So think about that when you start to model characters. You can either put in edge loops as you go along, or you can just make sure you have enough depending how you're modeling, so that if you're putting in a skeleton, you can deform it and it won't look like the Tin Man over here or over here. In the next video is going to be a surprise because I'm not quite sure what I'm going to make it on yet, so stay tuned.